We begin our story of hotels and resorts in the Salt River Valley in the year 1885, when Phoenix was a town of about 3,000 people, a very small area bounded by 7th Street on the east, 7th Avenue on the west, Harrison and the railroad tracks on the south, and Van Buren on the north. The Arizona Canal was just completed in 1885. The Southern Pacific Railroad had announced plans for a new branch line into Phoenix. The town was about to begin a major growth period in the late 1880s. As you can see, it's a fairly small town, agricultural in nature, a few major buildings, the courthouse, but mostly it's a town of small adobe homes and stores. Nothing over 2 stories, and very few frame buildings over 2 stories. But in 1887, the announced plans for the Southern Pacific Railroad for a branch line into Phoenix came to fruition. The Maricopa and Phoenix was completed to Phoenix, and the town began to receive a major influx of visitors, traveling salesmen, people interested in doing business and living in the Salt River Valley came in on the railroad. One of the first places they stayed was the brand new commercial hotel, a structure at the corner of Center Street, which we now call Central Avenue, and Jefferson. It was a commercial hotel for traveling salesmen and initially had 20 rooms. You can see here from the photograph it's a 3-story hotel. But where are these traveling salesmen going to spend a summer night in the Salt River Valley without swamp coolers, air conditioning, or cooling of any kind? It soon became apparent that you had to add sleeping porches to the commercial hotel, and that's what they did here. This is where beds would be rolled out, the French doors in the evening on a hot summer night to sleep. The commercial hotel was owned by George H.N. Lewis for many years. Later it became known as the Lewis Hotel, and just in the last few years it was torn down as part of a redevelopment project in downtown Phoenix. The next major hotel that grew up in Phoenix in these early years was the Ford Hotel in downtown Phoenix at the corner of Washington and 2nd Avenue. Was built by Dr. James Ford from Kansas City, Missouri, who, by the way, also had Winfield Scott out in the new town of Scottsdale plant a 40-acre citrus orchard for him. Ford was an investor, an entrepreneur, a doctor from Kansas City. He had Scott do some work out in Scottsdale, and he also built the Ford Hotel in downtown Phoenix. This is the lobby of the Ford Hotel, which is obviously a congregating place for men of the community. Before they built the Adams Hotel, this is where the men from the legislature would stay and ride the streetcars down to the Capitol. For many, many years, it was a fixture on the corner of 2nd Avenue and Washington. The first really big hotel, the Ford, by the way, had 60 rooms. The first really large hotel in the valley was the Adams. The Adams Hotel down at the corner of Center Street and Adams. It was made of pressed brick and brownstone, had one of the first elevators in Phoenix. Really shows the growth of the town from the little adobe to frame now to a pressed brick and a brownstone hotel. And of course you had the same problem. Where are you going to sleep in the summertime? A close-up of the side of the Adams shows the awnings that came down at night to give the sleepers, the guests of the hotel, some privacy when they would roll the beds out onto the balconies for sleeping. It must have been still a pretty dreary experience, but this was the state-of-the-art for hotels in the Salt River Valley in 1896. As we recall from our other history lessons, Scottsdale got its start in 1896. This is the Scottsdale Schoolhouse, which was built in September of 1896 on the Scottsdale town site. Shortly thereafter, in early 1897, James L. Davis got his commission as a postmaster and opened the Scottsdale Post Office and grocery store in downtown Scottsdale at the corner of Brown and Main Street. The Underhill family in that fall of 1897 built a large home in Scottsdale at the corner of Scottsdale Indian School Road on the northwest corner. The Underhills built it especially large because they wanted to take in winter visitors, take in boarders for the winter as a source of extra income. Scottsdale from the very beginning has been a home and haven for winter visitors. It's not something that just began occurring after the Second World War in the 1950s and 60s. It's been a part of Scottsdale ever since there was a Scottsdale. And it's one of the reasons we're discussing hotels and resorts. They've had a major impact on the growth of the valley, and especially a major impact on the growth of Scottsdale. We will leave it for future generations of historians to quantify how many people came as a result of a single stay here in Scottsdale. But the fact is, many people did come to stay and came back to live in later years. The first major resort, we've talked about hotels up to this point, but the first major resort in central Arizona really was the Castle Hot Springs. The Castle Hot Springs was developed in 1898 by Frank Murphy and his brother Oakes Murphy, Nathan Oakes Murphy, who was the governor of Arizona Territory. Frank had been instrumental in building another branch line railroad to Phoenix. It was called the Santa Fe, Prescott, and Phoenix. It came down from Ash Fork on the main line of the Santa Fe Railroad down through the mountains and valleys to Phoenix. Along the way, Murphy found a large gold mine, the Congress Gold Mine near Wickenburg, which he got a fellow named Diamond Joe Reynolds of St. Louis to invest in. And not far from the Congress Gold Mine on the same railroad, about 25 miles into the Bradshaw Mountains, was the Castle Hot Springs. It was a facility owned and run by Doc Holland as a place where miners could come and soak the cold out of their bones in the hot springs. The Murphy brothers bought it, built a spur off the SFP&P at Hot Springs Junction, where folks from the east could come in their private railroad cars from Philadelphia and New York and Chicago. They would be shunted off at Ash Fork and put on the branch line. And then at Hot Springs Junction, they would put on a siding. And the next morning, the folks would embark from their private cars and get on a stagecoach that would take them at 25 miles on a single road into Castle Hot Springs. This is the main lobby of the Castle Hot Springs. This is where John Kennedy stayed after his accident with PT-109 during the Second World War. Castle Hot Springs during that time frame was a recreation and rehabilitation center for the United States Army. After the war, of course, it became a very popular resort as well. This is the Palm House at Castle Hot Springs, a major living quarters. This, of course, is what everybody came for, the hot springs, and these are some of the old miners that Doc Holland catered to before the Murphy brothers bought the springs. This is what it looked like in the 40s after the war when they had cemented it in. It was still the reason to come to Castle Hot Springs is to get away from it all and soak in the hot springs there. They also had a formal pool, 9-hole golf course, a barber shop, beauty salon, places for skeet shooting and trap shooting. It was a wonderful isolated resort nestled in the foothills of the Bradshaw Mountains. Many people came and stayed. And as I mentioned, it's the very first resort of significance here in central Arizona. This is an aerial view of Castle Hot Springs. It stopped operation as a resort in the late 1960s. It was later given to Arizona State University. And just recently it was purchased by a group of Milwaukee, Wisconsin investors who plan to redevelop it as a resort and condominium complex. Castle Hot Springs, 1898. This is Phoenix, 1899, the turn of the century. You're looking at Washington Avenue, Washington Street, during the Midwinter Fair of 1899, when Phoenix had a population of about 5,000 people. It was the territorial capital, beginning to grow. Was much larger than the little town of Scottsdale way out in the valley. Let's look at some of the major homes in Phoenix to give you some idea of the difference. This is the home of Clark Churchill, who was the Attorney General of Arizona Territory. aspired to be governor, and this would be the governor's mansion. Unfortunately, Churchill didn't make it as governor, and unfortunately for him, and his home became the first home of Phoenix Union High School. These are the homes of Marcus Jacobs and John T. Dennis. Jacobs was a dry good merchant in downtown Phoenix. Dennis was a major real estate developer in Phoenix. These homes were located at about Monroe and 5th Street. And just across the way and down the block a bit was the Rawson House, built in 1895 for Dr. Richard Rawson, who was a local Phoenix physician. It's the only house of the four that we've just seen that still exists today. It's been redeveloped in downtown Phoenix. That gives you some sense of the Victorian nature of Phoenix at the turn of the century. There were still many small homes, frame homes, adobe cottages, adobe haciendas, and frame apartments. But this is some of the major homes, give you some idea of what Phoenix looked like during the turn of the century period. Scottsdale, by contrast, was a very small town of perhaps 75 people. No large Victorian homes, a few tents and cottages. The only large house was the Underhill home that you see here on the left, which incidentally is rather interesting. It began its career as the first site of winter visitors coming to Scottsdale, and in about 1909 it's going to be bought by Mr. Ed Graves, who came out to live in the valley for his health. He bought the old Underhill place. It promptly burned to the ground, but in its stead he built the Graves Guest Ranch. So that northwest corner of Scottsdale and Indian School is an historic guest spot in Scottsdale. This is the Graves Guest Ranch on the corner there. An interior view. Ed Graves also had one of the very first Indian curio stores, as they were called in those days, in downtown Phoenix, right across from the Adams Hotel that we saw earlier. He also ran a trading post from his guest ranch in Scottsdale, and these are some of the baskets that he has purchased from the Native Americans who came to trade. He also made trips up to the Hopi and Navajo reservations in the summertime to purchase baskets as well. These are the cottages at the Graves Guest Ranch. Not too many rooms in the main lodge. The major lodging was in these small tent houses behind the guest ranch, where both winter visitors and people with some health problems stayed to spend the winter in Scottsdale. Not only did the old Underhill place burn to the ground in 1909, but in 1910 the Adams Hotel burned to the ground. A huge major conflagration in downtown Phoenix. One of the interesting stories about that is just up the street from the Adams Hotel was a place called the American Kitchen, which was run by a Chinese gentleman named Mr. Singh. And this hotel burned to the ground early in the morning, and Mr. Singh went down to the Adams and picked up all of the guests who came scurrying out of the hotel in their bathrobes and took them up to the American Kitchen for breakfast so that they wouldn't be too inconvenienced. Part of the hospitality of Phoenix in the early days. Out of the ashes of the old Adams Hotel grew the new Adams, built in 1911, first major hotel in downtown Phoenix. The old Adams that burned to the ground had 200 rooms. The new Adams was built at a cost of $350,000, and it had 250 rooms. At this same time frame, the first resort in the Salt River Valley was under construction. Built during 1909, 1910, the Ingleside Inn was built just a mile and a half west of Scottsdale, the little town of Scottsdale, on an 800-acre piece of property owned by W.J. Murphy and the Arizona Improvement Company. The Arizona Improvement Company had been the holding company which had built the Arizona Canal and then purchased the major controlling interest in the other canals on the north side of the Salt River, and in addition had bought something like 25,000 acres of land underneath the Arizona Canal. They needed a place to bring winter visitors and potential investors to look at land, and they built the Ingleside Inn for that purpose, as a place to bring potential buyers of their property to look around the valley. It soon became a very popular spot for winter visitors such as Theodore Roosevelt and Whitelaw Reid, who was the publisher, New York publisher of the New York Tribune, I believe, and Sir Gilbert Parker, a famous Canadian author, came to stay at the Ingleside Inn. We will see more of that, the inn, just a little bit later. Just 3 years later, down in Chandler, Arizona, Dr. A.J. Chandler built the San Marcos Hotel for the very same reason that W.J. Murphy had built Ingleside Inn. Chandler owned something like 12,000 acres in the Chandler, Arizona area, and he wanted a place to bring potential buyers, to have winter visitors come to stay. If they liked it, they would buy some of his land. So he built the San Marcos in downtown Chandler, which became one of the most beautiful resorts in the valley. It's the oldest resort that still exists today. It's been recently purchased and refurbished, owned by the Sheraton Corporation now, the Sheraton Corporation. This is what the San Marcos looked like. The picture that we had seen earlier shows the San Marcos when it's brand new, without any plantings around it, or just some small twigs beginning to blossom. Here we see it when it's completely in a mature state, probably in the 1930s. The San Marcos was probably one of the most elegant resorts in the valley. It had mahogany woodwork and tile floors in the bathrooms, and huge closets that would accommodate large steamer trunks for world travelers who would come to stay at the San Marcos. Had many large oil paintings on the walls and in the rooms, beautiful Indian rugs, wicker furniture throughout. It was a quite elegant place that had a staff of Korean servants who would cater to the needs of the people at the San Marcos. This is the pool at the San Marcos. Beautiful spot over in Chandler. Again, it's the oldest resort that still exists in the valley today. This is an aerial view showing some of the patio areas at the San Marcos. This is where Jack Stewart gets his start. Jack Stewart, we will see later, was the major developer, along with John C. Lincoln, of the Camelback Inn. Jack got his start with a first-class hotel as the publicist in the 1920s for the San Marcos. Meanwhile, back in Scottsdale, the Graves Guest Ranch in the early 1920s is going along as a major tourist stop in the valley. The Kinney family had come out in 1922 from Columbus, Ohio, to enjoy the sunshine of the Salt River Valley. Stayed at the Graves Guest Ranch. This is Mrs. Kinney in the back seat, going along with Mary Graves out to the Indian reservation, out to the Pimas, to take a look around, to see the Native Americans on their reservation. In the meantime, while Mr. Kinney is over at Ingleside playing golf. Here he's putting out on one of the 9-hole golf course, one of the 9 holes of the Ingleside golf course. That's not tiff that he's putting out on, by the way. That's oiled sand. It was a desert golf course north of the Arizona Canal, in a desert environment. They didn't have the pumping equipment or the wherewithal to make it a lush green golf course. And as a result, you didn't have greens that were green at all. They were oiled sand and with a small roller to roll out the foot marks. It wasn't until 1927 that Ingleside had its first 18-hole major golf course, modern golf course as we would think of it today. This is the golf course at Ingleside. Unfortunately, this is all that's left of Ingleside today. The inn is no longer with us, nor the surrounding property. It's all subdivisions and homes. But the golf course is still there. It's now the golf course for the Arizona Country Club. This is the major entrance to Ingleside, which would have been on Indian School Road, just a little bit east of 56th Street. This photograph appeared in the Saturday Evening Post in about 1926. Ingleside was at that time, one of the great places to stay in the valley. This is the cottages at Ingleside. They were all named for flowers: Pansy Cottage and Tulip and Rose. Beautifully kept grounds, large orange orchards, one of the first citrus orchards in the Salt River Valley at Ingleside. Large olive orchard. It was a beautiful spot for people to come and spend the winter. The total amount of rooms at Ingleside, though, at any one time was only 50. This is the main dining room at Ingleside Inn, formal dining room. As I mentioned, there was a large olive grove at Ingleside. Ingleside also grew its own poultry, had a large flock of turkeys. They would feed the olives from the olive grove to the turkeys, and voila, the specialty of the house at Ingleside for dinner was olive-fed turkey. The picnics at Ingleside were no blanket and a bucket of Kentucky Fried Chicken for the folks. This is a formal picnic out in the desert. The staff would go out ahead of time and put out the tables, table linen, china, silver, a rather elaborate affair for some of the more formal picnics that the Ingleside guests could partake of. They also had some more casual picnics with just checkered tablecloths. Notice this is obviously a winter picnic. People are in their winter coats. Notice the cloche hats on the women from the 1920s and the camel hair caps on the men. Very stylish group of folks coming out in some Model Ts for obviously a desert picnic. Another view of some of a different picnic at Squaw Peak. Notice the wonderful old camel's hair cowboy hats on some of the folks on the left side of the photograph. This is that same Ingleside picnic. The lady with the parasol is Mrs. Corning of the Corning Glass family, who had come out to stay at Ingleside, one of the more prominent people to give their business to the Ingleside Club. Again, some great contrast here. We have jodhpurs and English riding boots, and also some Western chaps on the lady in the middle. Good combination of folks coming out to be real Westerners here in the Salt River Valley, also at Ingleside, at an Ingleside picnic. There were some Hopi Indians who lived at Ingleside as part of the staff. Often they would put on some paint and feathers for the children to meet a real American Indian. They also put on dances at Ingleside. Here is them doing a dance at one of the Ingleside picnics. But W.J. Murphy had also purchased the Echo Canyon on the north side of Camelback Mountain. It was part of the Ingleside property as well. And there he put in a permanent facility for picnics with tables and a dance pavilion. In a real respect, this is probably the first dinner theater in the Salt River Valley in Echo Canyon. It's part of the Ingleside amenities, part of the things that you entice people to the valley with was staying at Ingleside and having this kind of entertainment and these kinds of picnics in the wintertime in Arizona. Back in Scottsdale, the Adobe House in 1927 got its start. It was a very small inn, 6 rooms only. It was run by 2 women, Imogene Ireland and Mildred Bartholow. It had originally been built by a fellow named George Blount, who was an early pioneer in Scottsdale. In the teens, it had been the Casa Adobe, home of the George family, and later Frank Last and his wife Grace George lived there. It was called the Casa Adobe for a while. It was a cheese factory. But in the 1920s, these 2 ladies had turned it into a nice small resort in downtown Scottsdale, where horses were brought to the front door every morning to go riding. They had privileges at the golf courses in the area. You could come and stay and go to play golf in the area. It was a wonderful little place right in downtown Scottsdale. The site of the Adobe House is now the Scottsdale Police Department. Here is a wonderful ad for the Adobe House. It appeared in one of the early Phoenix magazines. The next inn to get its start in the valley was Jokaki Inn and Tea House. It had gotten its start as a tea house originally. It was the home of Robert and Sylvia Evans. Sylvia and her friend Lucy Cuthbert had got the idea of having a small business at the home. First it was a design studio interior decorating. That didn't go over too well. Next they decided to run a tea room out of the Evans home, and they would sell chicken salad sandwiches and tea and pieces of devil's food cake for 50 cents. Became a popular spot for the women of Phoenix to come out and have card parties and bridal showers and coming out parties for young women. They would bring their winter visitor friends for a nice trip to the desert, to the Evans quaint tea room. They begin pressing the Evans to let some of their eastern friends stay at the home underneath Camelback Mountain. And soon, in the fall of 1927, the Evans actually moved out of their home and began taking in winter visitors, and that became the genesis for Jockockie Inn. Jockockie became one of the most popular resorts in the valley. It's where the Astors and the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts stayed. It's where John Goldsworthy, the famous British author, stayed while he was writing the second Forsyth saga between 1926 and 1932. It was also built by the people of Scottsdale. The Rangels and the Yutzi and the Corral families all had a hand in building the Jockockie Inn with adobe bricks from an adobe pit where the Scottsdale Center for the Arts sits today. Of course, this is the cantina or the bar at Jockockie. Also, many of the young people of Scottsdale, the young men and women, waited on tables and were bellhops and maintenance people at the Jockockie. It was very much a Scottsdale resort in that respect. We had a great deal to do with it. Also, George Cavalier, the Scottsdale blacksmith, built or put on all of the ironwork at Jockockie. All of the ironwork on the outside of the windows and the balustrades were made by George Cavalier. We had a very fine tinsmith in Scottsdale named Barnaby Herrera. Barnaby did all the tin work for the light fixtures in Jockockie. Very much a Scottsdale place, the old Jockockie Inn. It's where Frank Lloyd Wright stayed before Taliesin West was completed. He spent 4 winters here at Jockockie. In about 1935, the famous Jockockie Towers were built that looked like the old Spanish mission. And of course, unfortunately, that is all that is left today. The site of Jockockie will now be, the grounds of Jockockie will now be, of course, the site for the new Phoenician resort going up much closer to the mountain. In 1928, this is the next year, the Hotel Westward Ho was completed in downtown Phoenix, originally called the Roosevelt Hotel after Theodore Roosevelt and his connection with the reclamation project here in the valley. The Westward Ho was the first really large hotel in the Phoenix area, 350 rooms, the largest hotel between El Paso and Los Angeles. The late 1920s was a tremendous boom time for the creation of resorts and hotels. It's the time that Miami and Miami Beach get started in Florida. It's the time that the Southern California hotels have a major growth, and also the Salt River Valley experiences it, and the Westward Ho is very much a part of it. Also, the Arizona Biltmore, which opened in February of 1929. The Biltmore was built by the MacArthur brothers, who owned a Dodge agency in downtown Phoenix. The fellow who designed it was Albert Chase MacArthur, their brother. MacArthur had been a student of Frank Lloyd Wright, and Wright came to visit his student, took part in the project for a while, and there's been a long controversy over whether Frank Lloyd Wright designed the Biltmore or Albert Chase MacArthur. The evidence that I've been able to see, the plans, the names on the plans, the correspondence, indicates to me that indeed Albert Chase MacArthur was the designer of the Arizona Biltmore. Robert Evans, who we mentioned earlier as being the developer of the Jockockie Inn, also had a construction business building adobe homes in the valley, and he also built the pool and casita area for the Arizona Biltmore, as well as the stables for the Biltmore. The Biltmore was a wonderful place. Many people of prominence, movie stars such as Douglas Fairbanks Sr., stayed at the Biltmore and here doing some rope tricks for some young guests. Mary Garden, who was this featured soprano with the Chicago Lyric Opera Company, came to stay at the Biltmore and play golf. The Wrigleys, of course, got involved in the Biltmore. They were involved in the early 1929 as a contributing partner with the MacArthur brothers, but with the crash of late 1929, October 1929, Mr. Wrigley had to take over the entire property and, of course, built the Wrigley Mansion up on the hill above the Biltmore Resort itself. The Biltmore in the 30s was also famous for a nice amenity that they had for their guests called the Wonder Bus Tours. These are the Wonder Buses lined up, ready to probably some place, perhaps Oak Creek Canyon, or up along the Mogollon Rim somewhere at a stop. They were probably the Wonder Buses could be considered some of the first motor homes ever developed in the United States. This is the interior of a Wonder Bus with the wicker based seats and the cabinetry, very much like a Pullman car that was set up for people to enjoy the scenery of Arizona and stay a few days in the wilds. They also had some trucks that were converted into tent-like affairs, again, very much like the modern motorhomes. You had a wrangler, of course, who would help set up the whole affair, put out the camp chairs, and cut some wood for a campfire. And, of course, in the beds would come out, and you'd have your own cook along. Notice a little buckaroo there in his 1920s era Western suit, and the ladies in their cloche hats of the late 1920s, early 30s. Not roughing it too much, but it must have been a lot of fun on the Wonder Bus tours for the Arizona Biltmore. Also in 1929, Thanksgiving Day, the Wigwam Resort in Litchfield Park was opened to the public for the first time. The Wigwam had been developed by Paul Litchfield, who was president of the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company. Goodyear had a major investment here in the valley in cotton lands. They built the Wigwam initially in about 1919 as an executive retreat for the executives of the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company. But in 1929, it was opened to the public for the first time. They had 24 guests. Jack Stewart, who, as I mentioned, got his start in the valley as a publicist at the San Marcos, became hotel manager for the Wigwam in 1933, in the depths of the Depression. He went back to Akron, Ohio to interview with Mr. Litchfield, convinced him he could do the job, set up on a tour of the United States talking to railroad ticket agents, and which were a major source of business, newspapers, influential people in communities. He met Eugene Pulliam in Indianapolis and brought Eugene Pulliam out to the valley to stay at the Wigwam. Of course, Mr. Pulliam fell in love with the valley. Later, when Jack went to the Camelback Inn, Mr. Pulliam came and stayed there as well, and of course bought the Republican Gazette shortly thereafter and made a major stake in the Arizona newspaper game. Another person that Jack Stewart brought to the Wigwam was Dan Gainey from North Dakota. And of course, Dan developed the Gainey Ranch, which is now becoming a major regional development in Scottsdale. So the Wigwam was another major, beautiful player in the development of resorts in the Salt River Valley. The valley has always been a spot for people to come, and even during the Great Depression, new resorts were built in the valley near Scottsdale to attract winter visitors. Camelback Inn was completed in Christmas of 1936, and it was immediately a very successful resort. Jack Stewart was brought in. It was his his brainchild, if you will, one of his dreams. He got the backing of John C. Lincoln of Lincoln Electric, who had been a major buyer of real estate in the Phoenix, Scottsdale area. Lincoln Drive, of course, is named after him, right outside the front door of the Camelback Inn. But Mr. Lincoln was the financier for the Camelback, and Jack Stewart was the manager-operator. Of course, this is what it looks like today. Mr. Lincoln, of course, was a stickler against alcohol. Another view of Camelback as it has developed today. So the people could not have a drink at Camelback, and that was the beginning for another resort in the valley, just down a stone's throw from Camelback, a place called El Chorro Lodge. But in 1936, it was the Judson School for Girls. It was built by George Judson, who had the famous Judson School for Boys in Paradise Valley, near Scottsdale. He was convinced to open a girls' school in the 1930s, but it was the Depression, of course. Things didn't go very well, and it closed as a girls' school in 1935 or 36. And in 1937, Mark Gruber came along and turned the Judson School for Girls into El Chorro Lodge. And of course, he had all the bar business from people at Camelback because they couldn't have a drink at Camelback Inn, so they came down to the beautiful patio and bar at El Chorro. In 1937, in Scottsdale, up on Scottsdale Road at Chaparral, the Kiami Lodge was constructed right in the middle of an orange orchard. Kiami apparently means flat roof. It was symbolic of the flat roofs of the inn. The facility was run by a family from Wichita, Kansas. They ran a golf course there in the summertime, and they brought the staff out to Arizona to run the Kiami Lodge in the wintertime. They got a young artist named Charles Lolema to design and carve and paint the entrance gates to Kiami. The early effort by Charles Lolema, of course, who was one of the most foremost designers of Native American jewelry, foremost artists today. This was one of his early efforts at Kiami Lodge back in the late 1930s. This is the pool at Kiami. Beautiful spot right in the middle of a huge orange grove. Another view. Again, the staff was a very convenient arrangement because the staff would not be out of work during the summertime. They would go back and run be the staff for the country club in Wichita. Kiami also had its own Hopi chief, Chief Kolshoftewa, who would beat the drum to invite everybody to the kiva for cocktails at Kiami at 5 o'clock. Again, another view showing the tremendous lack of development in Scottsdale in the 30s. It was still very much a very large agricultural area. This is from one of the roofs at Kiami Lodge looking over the nearby citrus orchards that were surrounding out towards the mountains. Obviously, still a very rural and beautiful setting for a resort in the Salt River Valley. Not only did we have resorts being developed in Scottsdale during the Depression, but also during the Second World War. This is the Casablanca Inn, which was developed by Mr. George Borg of the Borg-Warner Corporation. It had originally been built in the 1930s as the home for a fellow named Donald Kellogg. It's often been thought it was the Kellogg's of Battle Creek, Michigan, but not so. It was the Kellogg's of Buffalo, New York. They were a major importer of all different kinds of oils, and Donald was sort of the black sheep of the family. He didn't really care to be in the oil importing business. He wanted to be a pianist, and he had an especially huge living room so that he could play the piano in his beautiful home out here. It was a large, stately place that Mr. Borg bought and converted into the Casablanca in 1944. The minaret that you see there was on top of the dining room and kitchen area, which Borg added to the estate to enable him to have a hotel. It also sported the only private airstrip for a resort in Arizona at the time. Mrs. Borg was a private pilot and wanted an airstrip, and they built one. So part of their advertising was that the Casablanca had the only private, you could fly your own plane right to the resort. This is a latter-day photograph of Casablanca. Of course, it's recently been redeveloped into a condominium complex. Again, the entrance to Casablanca in the days just before the redevelopment process got underway. Paradise was built right at the end of the Second World War. In fact, there was many complaints that Robert Evans had used black market materials to build, and he had to get a letter from the Defense Department in Washington stating that the materials that he was using were not black market, and he did have every right to use them, and the letter was printed in the Phoenix Republic. But this is the Paradise Inn just down the road from Jokaki. Of course, that site is the exact site today where the the Phoenician resort is being developed at the time. So the spot is still a resort. It's just being recycled into a more modern mode. After the war, the home of Delos Cook was developed into the Royal Palms. Delos Cook was famous for his Cook's tour of Europe, travel business. He has something like 900 palm trees on the estate. a complete chapel, uh, a botanical garden of some of the most rare and exotic desert blooming plants imaginable, were all on the property of the estate of Mr. Cook. In 1948, it was redeveloped as the Royal Palms. This is what it looks like today. You're looking at the chapel, the bell tower of the chapel, at the original part of the estate, and the new room, not the new, but the rooms that were added on the left as bungalow cottages for the guests. In 1955, another major resort right in Scottsdale, the Valley Ho, was opened in December of 1955. Up to this point in time, most of the resorts had been small. Camelback was around 75 rooms. The San Marcos was 135. The Wigwam was 75 rooms. Ingleside Inn had been 50 rooms. Now you're developing resorts in Scottsdale in the valley that had large numbers of rooms, less expensive. The Valley Ho had over 200 rooms, and you could have a more middle-class group of people coming to stay. Of course, they loved what they saw and often came back and became a part of the population of Scottsdale. Just the next year, in 1955, the Safari was opened in downtown Scottsdale. Of course, it was later sold to the Ramada Corporation, and they run the Safari. But again, it's an in-town Scottsdale hotel resort with over 200 rooms that allows for more people to come and stay. The more people come and enjoy the wonderful winter climate of the Salt River Valley, the more will come back and stay in later years. Just a couple of years later, in 1959, Mountain Shadows was developed. Originally had 100 rooms, but they soon found out that that was sorely inadequate, and they changed the poolside casitas into rooms and added another 50 rooms to the hotel. And it's been a popular spot in the Scottsdale Paradise Valley area ever since. Mountain Shadows now features, of course, 54 holes of executive golf, wonderful pool area. It's a major stopping point for folks. It'll also be the major stopping point for our program because there was a tremendous explosion of hotels and resorts over the past 30 years, and we'll save that story for another day. Most of these resorts, of course, had wonderful amenities and places for childcare and places to bring your children and programs for them. But I think Scottsdale in the 1920s had the best idea of all. Bring the kids, enroll them in school, and then when you're out playing golf or taking a tour, let them play marbles in the middle of Scottsdale Road.